You were born in Selma?
Selma, Alabama.
Was your dad like a genius mathematician who found himself in Selma, Alabama?
No, quite the opposite, actually. Yeah, we actually did a interesting portrait interview. So on the Heidelberg website is like a whole thing of my life,
Yeah.
and we go into detail there. And one of the things I talk about there is my parents both immigrated from the U.S. before I was born. So they immigrated to the U.S. a little over 30 years ago before I was born. And my dad's a mechanical engineer. My mom was a microbiologist. And then when the family immigrated to the U.S., they couldn't practice at the time in the 70s. You couldn't quite practice when you immigrated to the U.S. And so they actually ended up working in a carpet factory. So they found a job in Rome, Georgia. So not in Alabama, but actually Rome, Georgia, working in a carpet factory. And then they got just enough money to buy a little motel. So they actually bought a motel, a 20-room motel in Selma, Alabama, and that's where I was born. So they actually went down the entrepreneurship path. At the time, in the 70s, when Indian immigrants came to the U.S., that was the businesses they were taking on, was the motel business, which is fascinating.
The grocery store business.
Yeah, grocery store, and then the and gas stations.
So did they move all the way up to Birmingham for you to go to high school?
So what happened was, Selma's only about an hour drive from Birmingham.
Really? How fast do you drive?
It's pretty, yeah, you can drive on the I-65, you can hit about 75 miles per hour.
Yeah, but first you have to get to 65.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But this was, when I was born in 81, and so at that time it wasn't as crazy traffic.
That's when I was working there.
Yeah. But so what happened was, so they actually bought a bigger motel, so a bigger business, and so they moved to Birmingham because they had made just enough money to sell the one that they had in Selma, and then they bought the one in Birmingham, and then they partnered up with my aunts and uncles, and so then they had investments all around the South. But it's actually the example of the American dream, where they literally came in with nothing, started a carpet factory, ran a business, basically did it all for the kids. They wouldn't ever buy themselves anything, they gave it all to the kids. Basically.
So the high school in Irondale, right?
I know, yeah.
That was like a local school?
Yeah, so the high school where I went to school in was a public high school. Alabama's not really known for great public schools in general, but we were lucky that we had a really good high school that was a magnet school. So basically, you had to test into it, so that you had to do IQ tests and those kinds of things. So they would bus the students that were in the gifted ed program to that high school, and so it was on the other side of the city for us. So it was like a 2-hour bus ride for me through traffic.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
the Alabama School of Math and Science.
So Alabama Math School. So that is a state of Alabama school. So the one I went to was Jefferson County IB School, which is a county school. So it was the Jefferson County International Baccalaureate School. So I had friends that went to the Alabama School of Fine Arts, actually.
Yeah, it sounds like my son did the same thing 10 years later.
Yeah.
He went to North Atlanta High School, and it was like a 45-minute bus ride to get over there every day. Yeah. And 45 minutes back. Georgia State was actually a lot closer.
Yeah.
So then you went to Tech. You chose Tech. Did you have offers from?
Yeah. So I went to Georgia Tech about 3 hours from Birmingham, Atlanta, and so it was part of the reason was to balance being close to home without being too close to home. So I could go home every other weekend to get the laundry done and get the Indian cooking that you can't get when you're off at college by yourself. So it was close enough that I would be home every other week without my parents showing up every week. So, but it wasn't. I didn't end up going to Boston to MIT or anything, or to the West Coast because it was way too far from home. So it was close enough.
Are you a big family? Do you have brothers, sisters?
Yeah, so yes, I have a brother and sister. I'm the oldest, so my brother's 4 years younger than me, so he's a professor in chemical engineering at the University of Chicago. And my sister is 8 years younger than me, and she's an OBGYN at UVA, University of Virginia. And then my parents are actually from big families too. My dad is one of 9, and my mom's one of 5. And so when you do the math around first cousins, I have over 50 first cousins. All in the U.S. So my entire family immigrated to the U.S. They all moved to the U.S. The oldest one moved, so my oldest uncle moved, and then they sponsored the second oldest, and they sponsored the other one, the other one, the other one. All are in the U.S. And so so anywhere I go in the U.S. I have a couch.
Yeah, my wife's got a friend like that, and her second son, Indian son, married a Chinese immigrant.
Okay.
First generation.
Yeah.
that was a wedding.
Mm-hmm.
Because her family came in from Beijing for
Yeah,
it,
yeah, yeah.
and some of his family came in from India for it.
Oh, interesting.
That was fun.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So, you know, I've read a little bit about you and
Okay.
your trajectory, and you seem like you have this, you know, like you're a theoretical computer scientist, but then you apply it in these small
Yeah.
businesses and then you spin them off.
Sure.
Was this part of the design? Is it just your natural, like what you do?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I never would have predicted that career trajectory. I think it was really in grad school where I realized that that's kind of what I was interested in. You know, I've never had like a real job. When I mean by real job is like actually, you know, graduate from school, then work for a company, and then like you're working for that company. It's always been kind of in the academic world. So, you know, my real job when I was in high school and even before that was working in the parents' motel. I didn't get paid for it. It was just the chores.
Right.
So, and so interesting fact is I've made 15,000 beds in my career because of all the beds I've made in my life. So, it's a lot of beds. So I've always been in the academic world, which is you have this kind of intellectual flexibility, which is just really unique in academia. And so I knew, you know, in undergrad I wanted to go down a graduate career path, so we did the PhD thing. And now after graduating from the PhD, I became a professor. So I always didn't have a real job. I was always an academic. But one of the things I realized was in graduate school, it's like, wow, this research is fun. I always call it a playground for me. But at the same time, I realized that it's a playground for a very small portion of the population. It's the people that think like me. It's like the academics that that I can talk to about like my research and go really deep conversations with. But that's a very small portion of the population. And what impact can I really have if I'm only if that's my community and that's the community that I'm trying to engage with, and that's where if I'm striving to do the best work in that community, that's great. But at the end of the day, I realized that there's no broader impact than that. Right? The average person won't understand what I'm doing. And so I realized that what I wanted to do was take the work that I'm doing in my community, research community in particular, and actually find opportunities to apply it so it actually has societal impact. And so that's when I realized in grad school, probably midway through grad school, that I really wanted to balance having academic impact, but also having kind of real world, real life impact with the work I do. And so that's where kind of taking the work I do, applying it to a problem that can actually solve something useful. And then a lot of times to have that kind of impact, you either have to spin it out as a company, or you have to translate it out of the lab. And so for a lot of the stuff I've done, there wasn't really an industry there that could adopt it. And so startups was what made sense for a lot of those efforts. But it's really coming to that realization that I have to translate it. Just because I have a paper that sits on a shelf, nobody's going to grab it and translate it for me. Right. So I'd always had to take the onus of trying to push it out the lab as much as I could.
Now, you did the graduate work at Washington, right?
Georgia Tech.
Oh,
so I was a lifer at Georgia Tech. So I was an undergrad at Georgia Tech and a PhD student there.
So did you get any help from the ATDC?
Oh yeah, ATDC, yes.
Yeah.
So I was actually, interestingly, I was actually the first, so when ATDC first started,
right.
my company, my startup company when I was a grad student was the first company they ever funded actually.
I'm sorry, what is ATDC?
So ATDC is basically, so this was a time when, like how you have incubators at universities where they help you with a startup and they kind of incubate you through the program. At Georgia Tech, they were fairly innovative at the time with this, is they had seed funding to take a research concept to basically translate it into a project. And so that was their program that they had created. It was well ahead of its time. A few years later, you'd have incubators and tech transfer offices that would invest in research, getting the research out of the lab. Like you see that everywhere almost now in most U.S. institutions. But Georgia Tech had this funding arm that basically helped translate research out of it.
They actually started it in '82.
Yeah.
I was a reporter for a local paper.
Yeah.
And they were in this little elementary school up by 10th Street.
Okay.
Totally like blown out, and just doors were gone, and people were just in the little rooms doing their thing.
Wow.
Because they really wanted to get business people to come in and talk to you guys.
Yeah.
So I guess you were the first to start as grad student faculty and talk to those guys.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sorry, real quick, can I interrupt? We have a lot of people here and a time constraint, so I'll try to avoid a monopoly on questions and keep everything on a more general level. Thank you.
Go.
Around what year were you involved in the program?
So I would say, I started, let's see, so graduated in 2008, so I would say between I started in 2006, 6, 7, and 8.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
You said that you wanted by your research to reach the society. Is this the reason that you chosen health sector?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, for sure. So right now I do a lot of work in healthcare. Prior to that, I did a lot of work in sustainability. So looking at how can you use computer science and sensors to help monitor energy and water usage and those kinds of things. And so for me, it was looking at grand challenges and how can I direct my research to help have an impact in grand challenges. And healthcare is one of the hardest challenges, and so there's not a shortage of problems there. But the other thing is that at this point, I mean, even early on in my faculty career, I always empower the students to pick the problems that they're interested in. And students these days, this is what they're interested in, right? So when somebody asks me, where's my research going? It's like, it's where my students want to go. And so these days, it's when you try to recruit creative, passionate, diverse set of students, it's when they are working on impactful problems is when you get these great students. And so part of it is that the intersection of what I'm interested in and also what these students want to do is actually overlaps a lot. But yeah, that's why I do a lot of healthcare research, is because I wanted to actually have direct impact. Yeah.
Did you spin out the environmental stuff into a different company?
Yeah, so the environmental stuff was a company called Zensi, which was acquired by Belkin. So Belkin's whole home automation platform called Wemo is the stuff that I built. And then we had a low power sensor company that basically was a little sensor technology we built that could do home sensing and IoT using a low point cell battery that lasts 25 years. So it was a really low power wireless platform. So that got acquired by Whirlpool and Sears. And then a few years later, I did a mobile health company, which Google acquired 2 years ago.
Tell us about the award. Your feelings. Did you expect to be awarded?
No, not really.
What does this mean to you?
What's that? Yeah, so I think the best thing it does, two things. One is it validates all the hard work that my students have done. It's weird that I get these awards. Like I've been really lucky to get like the MacArthur Award, the ACM Prize in Computing Award, all these awards. But I get the award, but it's not my award. It's my students' award. So it's always an odd thing for me to get a personal award when it's really the culmination of the work that my graduate students in my lab have done. So I think it's great to it basically showcases the great work that they've done. That's the first thing. So the second thing is that I'm glad that a lot more applied research is being recognized because it's really hard sometimes in a theoretical field or in a field which is very nascent and starting to get, computer science is a fairly young field. And so to establish computer science as a field in its own, there was a lot of work that happened to do that, to differentiate it from mathematics and from other sciences. You often get the debate of, is computer science a real science and all that. And for me, those debates don't make a difference, right? Because it's what you do with that knowledge is what really makes a difference. But the notion that you can do applied research and still have a successful career is what I've always wanted to make sure students really internalize. And what that means is these awards recognizes that kind of work and motivates the students to do applied work. I think that's the thing that's really, I think that's the thing that comes out of these awards that I think is really great.
How would you explain the importance of the problems you're working on currently to the wide audience, to ordinary people who are not into computer science?
Yeah, I think the thing to think about, so one is to have an impact on healthcare, you have to realize that you don't have to just be an MD to have an impact on healthcare, right? A doctor is a recipient of the technologies and the innovations to be able to disseminate that knowledge, to cure people, help people. But really, to have an impact on healthcare requires innovations in all sectors, right? Policy, regulatory, technology, bioscience, bioengineering, chemistry. And computing is just one area. And I think one of the things to realize is that people have a mobile phone and that you take this thing for granted all the time. But the technology that goes into this has so much crossover impact, right? Just because somebody built a game called Angry Birds and everybody uses a lot, doesn't mean it's just solved one problem. The research that went into solving those algorithmic problems actually has a lot of applications outside of it. It's finding researchers that can take one problem that somebody solved and taking those concepts and solving a different problem. So I think one of the things that society should realize is that computing is solving some really important problems, and it's just not for entertainment. Right, that a lot of things that are driving innovations right now is that computing is like at the forefront of that, and people don't notice that, right? That's the thing that society doesn't really notice is that the biggest leaps that we've had in sustainability, in electric vehicles, and in healthcare have actually been all computing driven.
Mm-hmm.
if you think about battery technology, so battery chemistry has plateaued. So if you look at the last 5 years, batteries have kind of like basically barely have changed in the last 5-10 years. It's the reason why these things last longer is because computing has advanced. These things are more efficient, not necessarily because battery technology is better. So I think computing is what I call the multiplier. So if you have a therapeutic that works 5% of the time, the computing can be the multiplier that makes it work 30 or 40 or 50% of the time. So I think that's the thing that society should realize is that computing is actually a multiplier on things that we've kind of stalled out on.
Could technology solve all the problems that humanity faces today? And what couldn't solve?
Yeah, I wish computing could solve all humanity problems, but unfortunately it can't. In fact, one could argue that computing has caused a lot of the problems in humanity. And so I think we have to look, it's a double-edged sword. It's something that Professor Bengio talked about in his talk where he talked about AI for good. I'm glad he ended with AI for good. But I think the challenge, so I think one of the things as computer scientists we have to realize is that yes, technology can enable a lot of great opportunity. There's a lot of great opportunities with technology, but you don't necessarily need to solve everything with technology, right? And I think that's the pitfall that we're going to run into is that you try to throw computer science at everything, and that might not be the right thing. Like there's a lot of political or social or even, if you think about privacy, there's a whole different kind of ethical set of issues that transcend computer science, right? So I think there's really a combination of things like policy and computing need to come together, but computing is not going to solve all of that, right? Some of the biggest challenges can be solved with other approaches, right? It could be mediated by technology. It's a way to democratize something. It might be a way to disseminate information, but it by itself can't solve everything. So I think that's something that we have to strike a balance with.
That was my next, my next question. If technology can upgrade democracy. Mm-hmm. But you said something about that now. So.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so I think some of the work I do, I try to do that where we're trying to democratize healthcare. Where how do you get healthcare into the hands of people that might not have access to it or might be difficult, and if technology is already being embedded either through phones or other mechanisms, if you can enable those devices to be able to have the same level of accuracy or opportunity as people that might have access to it, then you have a way to really democratize healthcare potentially. And so I think it's a way to disseminate knowledge and tools that might not have been possible before because you might not be able to get it in a particular region because manufacturing is not available there, or you might not have the expertise there. But being able to up-level either community health workers or people that are helping a community, or anybody helping a community, I think is a way to kind of normalize or level set. So it's an enabler for kind of democratizing certain things.
So what's the healthcare unit you started to do? The one you sold to Google?
Yeah, so that was a lot of the work we're doing in digital health around using phones for screening and diagnosis. I guess, what was it? The statistic is that in the next, probably by 2022 or 2023, there's going to be more phones than people in the world. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, if you have this pretty ubiquitous mobile platform, a mobile phone, how much can you put in a phone to be able to help with healthcare? Not just collecting data or helping manage one's health record, but more around, could you use it for screening and diagnosis? And so we did a lot of work in that space, and that was the context of that work.
And what was the company called?
Synosis.
Ah,
yeah. Do you think your family's history as entrepreneurs helped you in this career path?
That's a good question. So in India, my family weren't very entrepreneurial. One could argue they were entrepreneurial in the sense that my dad's side of the family were farmers, and so there's a little bit of entrepreneurship there. When they came to the U.S., the hotel industry was just what was available at the time. That's what Indian immigrants at the time were doing. But what actually taught me was less around the entrepreneurship of the business part of it, but was more of the hard work and more of the kind of the perseverance is what I learned more from it. Because I could see my parents ran their business themselves, so they actually did their own night shifts. Like they didn't actually hire somebody to do the night shifts. My mom did the day shifts. My dad would do the 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. shift. Then he would actually go to sleep. Then my mom would take over. So I saw the perseverance and kind of the hard work they put into their business. I think that's what inspired me. Less around like the business logistics and finances. It was really the intangibles.
Okay. And also on this note, you once said that you like to tackle problems through something called naive innovation.
Oh yes, yeah.
So by going outside your area of expertise, so what's your thought process around this?
Yeah, so just a little bit of context there. So there's this thing that I call naive innovation, which is this idea that you're not an expert in a particular area. You might have a little bit of knowledge in that area. And healthcare is an example of that. I never got an MD, so I'm not an actual physician or don't really have healthcare experience. I've learned it over time. I've been doing research in healthcare for a decade now, so I know enough of it to be dangerous with it. But the idea of naive innovation is that if you take somebody that has a particular deep skill set, and you give them a problem domain that they don't really have that kind of entrenched history or knowledge, they may actually come up with a really interesting solution just because they're not biased by just the dogma of what you do in that space. So if you took a health researcher, a medical researcher that's been doing this for 25 years, and got them to innovate in that space, their innovations will be fairly incremental because they're very biased towards how.
I'm from South Africa. Who do you partner with?
Yeah, UCT and the Desmond Tutu Foundation. Okay. Yep.
It seems to me that one of the big problems there would be filtering out noise, that it's a very weak signal.
Yeah.
Do you have unusual techniques for that?
Yeah. So you have like background noises, cars, in the background, cars backfiring. So what it does, it's actually pretty aggressive in terms of making sure the background's quiet. So if it notices a lot of background noise, it'll make you redo it. So there's a lot of filtering you have to do.
I also mean data noise, for example, for the photo of the fingers.
Oh yeah. No, it's so for those kinds of things. We're limited to which phones it can be deployed on. So primarily it's on Android phones because those are more ubiquitous outside the US. But we limited to the type of phone. So what we did for those deployments is we just deploy the phones. So the Ministry of Health just buys the phones. We just put the app on it and they just deploy 10,000 phones or whatever.
Cool.
Yeah.
And you have mentioned that the key is your noise is my signal.
Oh yeah.
And how do you figure out this very creative way?
Yeah. I think that so the concept of your noise is my signal kind of permeates my entire research career, and so this was this came out of the realization that when when a researcher is trying to tackle a problem, they're trying to tackle the problem that's in front of them, right? Oh, I'm gonna analyze this sound to create an algorithm to detect what the words are, right? So NLP processing. Or I have this picture, I'm gonna do computer vision on it to see it's a cat or a dog, right? So you're working on that primary problem. But what I found was whenever somebody's solving a particular problem, the times where it doesn't work could actually be the solution for something else. So a great example for this is the project that I just mentioned earlier, which was the audio processing for pulmonary ailments. So the trick that we played there was that there was this whole history of audio processing that was done where you basically there was probably 20 years of research where people focus on trying to remove the vocal tract noise. So when I'm speaking, my vocal tract, the noise that's created from my vocal tract, actually causes a lot of these algorithms to not work well. So researchers try to figure out filters to cancel out my vocal tract so the words coming out are easier to interpret. But it turned out that when you are canceling out the vocal tract noise, that same signal tells me what my lung function is. Because when you zoom into that signal, it's actually indicative of what my airflow patterns are. And so when people have been looking at things that to them have been noise signals, if you turn the problem on its head and you look at that thing that people have been trying to filter out, could actually be the source for other solutions. So that's been really kind of a key way that we've looked at a lot of problems in the past, is turn the problem on its head. Another example of when we did this was, old phones, whenever your phone got next to a speaker, it kind of would buzz. So I don't know if you've ever had that situation when your phone's about to ring, the speakers go crazy. So that's basically the electromagnetic noise that's coupling onto the wire that's going to the speaker. So it's just the electrical noise that's radiating off of it. So now it doesn't do that, right? A lot of times it doesn't do that because we have all these digital filters and those kinds of things. But it turned out that that noise is actually really helpful to analyze what devices are being used. And so that was a lot of the work we used for our energy monitoring work. So the concept of these signals that people ignore can actually be a solution to other problems is kind of a theme that's been a topic for a lot of our research projects.
Yeah, and not only for this, in the traditional training of an engineer, it seems not so focused on the skill of listening and also having empathy. So how did you achieve this successfully?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one of those things you can't quite train. You can't. This is not an engineering trait that you can train. Yeah, so I think it's more of a mindset. It's so the way that my students approach this is that I think they're in an environment where this is the kind of creative thought process that they go through, and they learn it through that, right? It's just a different way of thinking about the problem. You can't teach it, but I think when you have enough examples of it, I think students will start to gravitate towards those solutions. So a lot of my projects, especially for first-year students, are very collaborative. So they pair up with a graduate student that's a little bit more senior, working on a difficult problem, and then I think they start to learn and internalize it through that process. But it's something that it can't be taught easily. But after you go through a couple examples of it, I think you start to internalize that way of thinking about a problem.
Yeah. Will you define it as a design thinking process?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
So you mentioned working with a lot of different governments and foundations on these apps. What's been your process to establish those collaborations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think part of it is that working with governments and policymakers is actually absolutely critical to get that stuff out there. So part of it is I've been lucky where the work has gotten enough visibility that those agencies have reached out to us. Like for the Peru research, that was literally our paper got published, and then the Ministry of Health reached out to us. So what's important for us is to actually disseminate the work in unique ways, because if it's in a research publication journal, they might not see that, right? So we have other ways that we disseminate the work to be able to get it in front of people that might be able to have the influence. But one of the things that we do is that often when a paper gets published, we don't just send it to the journal. We actually go to the stakeholders that actually benefit the most. So we present these at the health conferences. We'll go and do poster presentations at some of these communities that aren't even my immediate research community. And so going that last mile helps a lot. Because often, graduate students in computer science get the feedback, oh, if you publish that paper in a conference that's not a computer science conference, it's not going to count. I was like, that doesn't make any sense at all. And so it's really looking after the broader goal of having that impact. And so a lot of the students actually take that step of engaging with policymakers, engaging with NGOs where, traditionally probably didn't count because why are you doing it? Because it's not contributing back to computer science. But having that culture within the lab that we take it to that next level where we engage policymakers and NGOs is why we're able to get that visibility. And so I think it's that, and I think that's just something different about what we do. Yeah.
Do you have any concerns? What's your biggest concern right now as a human, as a personality?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the things I alluded to before, which is what Professor Bengio talked about, was all the AI is a great tool, but I think the challenge with that is there's a lot of other secondary use cases for it. So I think one of the challenges I have right now is that computing is advancing so fast and so rapidly that policy and how society can adapt to it is not advancing fast enough. Everybody talks about Moore's Law, everybody talks about the exponential growth of computing, but society doesn't advance exponentially, unfortunately. And so that's why, think about security and privacy. Privacy is a big issue, and I think we're not able to answer those questions fast enough. And I think that's my big concern, is I think technology is going here, and society is advancing very slowly, if not flat, right? And I think that's my biggest concern. I think the divergence of societal problems and societal needs from what computing's doing, I just worry that gap's going to get bigger and bigger. So this is something that I try to instill in my grad students, is when they think about a problem, are they solving a problem? But if they are solving a problem, what are the unintended consequences of the solutions? So thinking about unintended consequences ahead of time is something that's going to be more and more important.
I call that Moore's Law of training. There is no Moore's Law.
There's no Moore's Law. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
We just learn as fast as we learn.
Yeah, exactly. You can't accelerate.
So breaking out and trying to broaden the reach of what you're able to teach is very important.
Yeah. And then also having a balanced view of what we teach too, right? So it used to be, the saying is that security is always a afterthought, right? It's the last class you take before you graduate. It's like, well, shouldn't it have been the first class? Or shouldn't that be kind of infused across the entire curriculum instead of a class? Why is security even a class, right? It shouldn't be a class. It should be kind of infused in every part of the curriculum. So I think the way we educate future computer scientists is going to be critical too. So that's something that is happening, but we got to do a better job of.
Technology is a tool to make our lives better.
Sure.
But sometimes technology turns to our lives, is our life.
Yeah.
What can we do for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I ponder this all the time because I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old at home who pretty much know how an iPhone or a phone works, and we haven't ever given them a phone, right? So they've observed society enough that they know exactly how to interact. They have a mental model of how to interact with a smartphone, even though they themselves don't have a smartphone, right? And so society's kind of adapting to this, and even the next generation is adapting to it. So my take on it is that we don't fight against it, because I think that causes more issues. I think technology's done some great things, and I think society's moving in a direction where we have to embrace technology, but we have to do it in a thoughtful way. So I think my thinking around this is that what are the thoughtful user interactions with technology, and make those the things that are at the forefront. Because I think a lot of the things that we need to do right now also is to educate kind of industry in terms of what the actual societal needs are. Because right now, if you think about industry, they're looking at opportunities to build technology that is so interesting and exciting that they can't live without it, right? Which shouldn't be that should not be the lead-in. The lead-in is not, I want to build the most addictive technology. That's not how you want to think about it. Can we build technology that's solving an actual human need that we couldn't solve before, and you're closing a gap, right? And I think the narrative needs to change broadly to be able to actually integrate technology in our lives the right way. And I think unfortunately the narrative has been a little bit different, where it's let's create the addictive app, the addictive technology, or the thing that I can't live without, which I don't think should be the lead-in. So I think when we change the way we approach what technology should do, I think that's when we'll start to get there. And I think that's been one of the challenges right now.
It's only words.
Yeah,
it's very difficult.
Oh yeah.
In my country, we have a lot of accidents because they are talking
on
the phone while driving.
Yeah.
The whole city is being killed, on the roads.
Yeah.
Because of technology.
Because of technology, exactly. Yeah. And I think this is the opportunity for technology companies to basically put a stake in the ground and say that these are the things that are priorities. Some companies are starting to do things around, looking at kind of social well-being or personal well-being, where the devices limit how often they can run, those kinds of things. So that's just one baby step. But I think a lot of companies need to take the onus on being able to, they're the ones that can actually have the biggest impact because they control the devices, right? And I think when that becomes a first-class citizen, until that, it's going to be really tough. Yeah, because policy can only go so far, right? So with those kinds of things, because people get around it. Yeah.
So I teach maths at university.
Okay.
And a lot of my students will ask me, what kind of topics, subjects should they be focusing on?
Oh, interesting.
Wanting to go into technology, app development, software like yourself.
Okay.
So do you have any suggestions in general? What kind of fields within maths would be helpful, or what kind of stuff do you use, or do you touch on?
Yeah, that's a good question. My work is fairly broad, and so we touch on many different areas of mathematics. What I would say is two things. One is having a core understanding of the fundamentals will always serve them well. I mean, but the problem is that to teach a student that the fundamentals are important is just so hard because they don't see there's still a big gulf between the fundamentals and what they can do with it. And I think as an educator, I think the best thing that you can do is actually show them the direct impact of what they're learning and working on in terms of what the applications are, right? That's something that I do in the classroom a lot too. Every theoretical concept has a direct practical application, which I go through the entire history on how that gets connected from this concept to the actual practice, makes a big difference. One thing that I borrowed from our research community that we've done is for some of my undergraduate classes, we'll dissect a smartphone and talk about every component that they just learned at the end of this course actually had the impact on that, like making that link, that look, here's the direct link back. But in terms of in terms of the things that I think are long lost arts, I think those are things to focus on. Is that there's a bit, because we're going to in computing we have so many tools to be able to take a data set, run it throw a machine learning model on top of it and get an output without knowing any of the fundamentals, we're losing this notion of kind of what it means to model and be able to simulate a lot of these concepts. Because you can actually, in simulation, predict what the output of these things are before you can throw some of these black box techniques at them. So in math, a lot of the students that come out of these math fields, being able to model the physics, being able to do the simulation is actually really critical, and a lot of grad students don't do that anymore, right? They just take the data set and throw a learning network at it, right? And they hopefully get an output. But a lot of those things aren't going to be explainable. And so there's going to be, I would say, in the next 5 years, a gap where there aren't going to be a lot of students that understand enough of the basics to do any of the physics modeling or the simulations. And I already see that with my own undergrads, is that they just don't take those classes anymore because they think these toolboxes are enough for them to kind of get by. And this exactly happened with the computer engineer. So when computer science was very hot in the 90s, when you had every .com popping up, you had all these computer scientists that were graduating, the long lost art of the computer engineer went away. You had all these software engineers, you had very few people that could build the embedded systems to optimize on the mobile phone. And then when the phones came out, that was the hot areas, those computer engineers who don't exist anymore, right? And I think it's going to be the modelers and the simulators that aren't going to exist. So.
I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions tops.
Okay.
Any reason why you tend to sell the companies fast?
That's just my personality. I mean, I could, have the companies. I could run it through an IPO. But for me, 2 or 3 years is kind of usually how long I want to do something like that, and then hand it over to somebody that knows what they're doing, and then I'll move on to the next thing. So it's more of my personality. It's I think I've incubated it far enough that now I think a company can take it on, who has the resources and who can internalize it into their roadmap. And I think that's a better model for the kind of work I do than to see a whole enterprise all the way through, because then at that time, the enterprise will suck my time up and I can't do the innovation.
So those are like graduate students at Wally Home?
Yeah, and there were graduate students there, yeah. But yeah, it's basically getting it to a point where it's mature enough that if it's ready for industry should take it on. I don't think I should create a competing industry around it. Part of it's just, and I just want to go back to the next thing.
Right.
It's just my personality.
You want to be doing another story.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, that's just kind of my take on it. Is when it's mature enough and I'm comfortable enough that there's going to be a good home for it, then I should let the adults take over.
We need role models.
Okay.
We don't have role models. We need scientists as role models.
Okay.
That means that you have to go out there and to talk to people about science. Do you do that?
Yeah, I actually have this interesting kind of metric I use for saying yes or no to things. So I get asked to do a lot of talks, which is great. But at the same time, I can't say yes to everything. So I have this latest thing I've been doing the last 5 or 6 years is that I rarely say yes to a top university, because I can go get a talk at MIT or CMU or whatever anytime. So I only I give basically most of my talks at the universities where those students don't quite get the visibility of researchers, top researchers. So actually, when I say yes to a particular, like a distinguished lecture or one of those things, I usually don't say yes to the top schools. I usually go to the places that are in the rural areas, or if they're areas that probably most researchers would say no to, just because, I don't have time for that, I would rather go give this talk at this top university. And so that's one thing I do. I also prioritize my high school and my K through 12 talks over the college talks, because I've recorded enough of these things that you can just watch my video. But when engaging with kindergartners to 12th graders is very different. You can't just give them a YouTube video. You actually have to be there in person to see kind of see the passion. And so I do a lot of K through 12 outreach. So I mentioned I have a high school outreach program. We usually host about 200 to 300 students in my lab a year. We have many workshops we do there. And part of it is personal passion too, because I was so lucky that I did my first research project in high school. And that was just because I happened to find a lab, and I was super lucky. And because I did that, it completely changed my career trajectory. So I want to make sure I get in front of students early on, before they even get into college, that look, here here's how you can have impact on society, and here are the different areas you can have impact. So I prioritize a lot more of that stuff now than just the same old distinguished lecturers and those kinds of things.
So earlier you were talking about the negative side effects of technology, and you mentioned that one of the reasons it's so pervasive is that they're designed to be addictive.
Yeah.
You're not in the industry, but as an entrepreneur, what do you think can be done to alleviate that? Obviously, there's an economic incentive in terms of getting people to keep using your products.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean that's a tough one. It's you're trying to contend with an industry where they're trying to make something where they have a monetary value to it. I think the way to do that is to demonstrate to industry, and I think you can prove this, is that you can have an impact on society that is not creating an addictive tool or an app, because you can actually have broader reach to it. So if you think about a lot of the things that are addictive or technology, it actually serves a very narrow need. And by the time that need gets addressed, you're trying to innovate for the next addictive thing, right? So you're in this cycle that actually is not going to be sustainable. And so at some point, you're just not going to have that advantage as a company, right? And so if you think holistically and you're trying to solve a societal need, then I think you're in it for the long game. I think you're solving a long-term problem. Because a lot of the kind of the technologies or gadgets or widgets that are built to solve or go after some addictive nature, or I gotta have this tool or this thing, was very narrow and short-term, right? And so they're always chasing this thing. And so I think that's the thing that we have to really try to figure out as a society, get industry to think about kind of the long-term, the long tail. And I think some companies are starting to do an okay job of that. They're like, let's focus on like health disparities. Let's focus on these kinds of things. But it's